Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. Today we are going to explore the history of Chestnut Hill Cemetery in East Brunswick. Historians have long remarked that there is no other site that one can stand face to face with the past than in a cemetery. They hold many different stories on many different layers. For most of us, cemeteries are the story of the people that are buried there, or what we would call the genealogical record, the story of individuals or families and their relationship to each other. There is the story of the cemetery itself. Cemeteries were never static. Their designs changed as people's views changed on the way society should handle the dead. All we need to do is look at a church graveyard from the 1700s with its haphazard display of ancient tombstones and a modern memorial park with straight rows of flush-with-the-ground grave markers. They are both very different. So the designs of cemeteries is another layer, another story. Then we have the markers themselves. The styles and symbols carved onto the stones also changed as people's views changed about death and commemoration. Not to mention the different materials that were also used. Here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, cemetery that was founded in 1863, 5 different materials for markers have been utilized. And finally, we have the story of those that carved the stones. Who were these carvers that picked up a mallet and chisel and carved these forms of commemoration? Where did they get their designs from? On today's episode, we are going to peel back all the different layers and tell the story of Chestnut Hill Cemetery. So sit back and relax and join me as we travel down the history trail. Chestnut Hill Cemetery was incorporated in 1863. The cemetery was influenced by a movement of cemetery design called the garden cemetery or the rural cemetery movement. Prior to this time, many burial grounds were associated with churches, church burial grounds, or family members that were buried on private property. Many of these church burial grounds dated back to the 1700s and the late 1600s at the time of settlement. So by the early 1800s, they were a dizzying array of headstones in a very crowded condition. This led to a new movement of cemetery design called the garden cemetery movement. The movement has its roots in France in the late 1700s with the formation of the Paris cemetery Père Lachaise. This cemetery was very different than the earlier church burial grounds. It was built with the landscape in mind. It had elaborate plantings, winding pathways, and many natural park-like features. This design movement caught on, and here in the United States, the first garden cemetery was Mount Auburn, established in Cambridge, Massachusetts. From there, Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, and Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery in 1838. New Jersey's first garden cemetery was Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which was incorporated in 1844. So by the time Chestnut Hill Cemetery was incorporated in 1863, garden cemeteries could be found in communities throughout the United States. If we look at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, we can see the influence of the garden cemetery movement. Its situation on top of the hill with this wonderful panoramic view of the natural surrounding overlooking the communities in essence which it served. There were elaborate plantings, winding paths, and another design feature common with the garden cemeteries, the incorporation of family plots. In the 18th century, many churchyards had single plots. By the 19th century, with the garden cemetery movement, plots were purchased as a family grouping. Here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, a family could purchase 12 single plots, which made up a family plot. And so as we walk through Chestnut Hill Cemetery, we can see family groupings together. And many of these families are residents that lived in East Brunswick in the 19th century. We're here at the top of Chestnut Hill in the Rogers plot. The Rogers family were prominent residents of the what was known as the Old Bridge section of East Brunswick, and buried right over here is Captain William Rogers, who was born in 1813 and died in 1895. As the stone mentions, Captain William Rogers, he was the captain of a sailing vessel on the South River. He lived just over the hill. His house is still standing in what's now the township's historic district. And the community was located at the head of navigation for the South River. This was the highest point on the South River that a sailing vessel could travel. And in the 1700s and early 1800s, there were a number of residents who made their living off of transporting farm produce to the large markets in New York City. And Captain William Rogers was among those individuals who owned a sailing vessel and transported goods to New York City. Also buried in the family plot are his wife, Adeline, and we have a grave marker here for his daughter, Henrietta. As we mentioned earlier, cemeteries can tell us wonderful genealogical information, the story of the people. And when we take a look carefully at this marker, there's much genealogical information here and some information that we can decipher. We have the name of the individual, Henrietta Rogers. She was married, the wife of Garrett Bown. Her death date in 1861, and she was only 23 years old. If we look at the marker next to hers, it's the marker for her child, George Henry, who died at 3 months in 1862. It's quite possible that when we go back 3 months, we go back to the time of Henrietta's death, and it's quite possible that Henrietta died from complications from childbirth, which were common in the 19th century. The marker is made from marble. At one time may have had a draped urn placed on the top of it, which is now missing, and may also have sat up on a base very similar to the one next to the marker for her son. At some point it fell over, the urn went missing, and the bottom portion of it was sunk into the cement block. But it shows us that the stones have genealogical information. We have names, birth dates, death dates, and by looking at the relationship to other markers nearby, we may be able to also understand how a particular individual passed on. At the very top of Chestnut Hill Cemetery is a marker that commemorates William Augustus Rogers. William Rogers was the son of Captain William Rogers and Adeline Rogers. He was born in 1841, and he was killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville during the Civil War in 1863. His family commemorated him by placing and purchasing this large marble obelisk. These designs were common in the mid-19th century, and the material is marble, and if we look carefully at it, we can see how it's eroded. In fact, the epitaph has completely worn off the face of the stone. When this marker was brand new in the 1860s, it had a very white, highly polished surface to it. But sitting out in the elements for well over 100 years, and on the very top of this hill where it's subjected to the rain and the wind, more so than in other places in the cemetery, it's eroded. It wasn't the best choice of material for the time, but they had a limited understanding of how these stones would erode. Wouldn't be until the later part of the 1800s that a new material came out, granite, which we'll discuss a little later. But there's some hints on this stone that help us tell us who carved the marker. And if we look carefully, we can see those hints. Again, we have the epitaph here, And as we travel down towards the base of the stone, we can see the signature of the carver. And it says, Silcox and Company, and then that's NB for New Brunswick. The Silcox family came from a long, prominent line of tombstone carvers in central New Jersey, dating back to the late 1700s. By the mid-1800s, there were two brothers, James Silcox and his brother Gabriel, that were operating the shop in New Brunswick. So in 1863, when William died during the Civil War, his father would have gone to New Brunswick to purchase this marker. It was carved by hand with a mallet and chisel by the family, and they signed again at the base. The other markers that we showed earlier, George Henry and Henrietta, those markers too came from the Silcox shop in New Brunswick. We're standing in the Bloodgood family plot. As I mentioned earlier, one of the characteristics of the garden cemetery movement were the purchasing of family plots, and we have a great example here. The Bloodgood family were prominent residents in what's now the township's historic district. In fact, their house is, that they lived in is still standing on Cosman Street. Saxton Bloodgood was an early superintendent of Chestnut Hill Cemetery and one of the grave diggers here in the 19th century. And with the family plots, we can see the large, and in this case, a very massive central family monument. The family members are not buried underneath this. They're out in front in the family plot, and we can see their stones with the initials that correspond to the names on the central family monument. These are all granite, and granite became a popular material in the late 1800s as new technology was developed to quarry the granite in places like Vermont and Massachusetts, and a better transportation system to ship these large pieces of granite to monument makers in New Jersey who transformed the material into cemetery monuments. This one is in different sections, which of course made it somewhat easier to assemble at the cemetery. There's different finishes. There's a rock-faced finish on the base and a polished surface on the central portion of the monument. Now, on monuments like this, carvers couldn't use a mallet and chisel. Granite is just much too hard to hand-carve lettering and designs on it. What was developed in the late 1800s were pneumatic chisels. These were chisels that operated off of compressed air, operating much the same as a jackhammer. And with the force of these new mechanized tools, they were able to carve the lettering and many of the designs that you see on this monument. Legend has it that when this monument was erected in the 1800s, that there were several horses that pulled all of these pieces up to the top of the cemetery. And the legend goes that there were a couple of them that keeled over after being exhausted from moving these massive pieces of granite. We do know in 1918, Bill Kramer, a local resident who lived in the Old Bridge section of East Brunswick, during 1918, he came to the top of this cemetery and climbed to the top of this monument and looked out over into Sayreville, New Jersey, where there was an ammunition factory in 1918 that had caught fire, and there were various explosions that were taking place from within inside the building. And he once told me from the spot sitting on top of the monument, he could look out into Sayreville where this munitions factory was and see whole buildings blowing up from the calamity that was happening several miles away. There are different varieties of marker materials that we can find here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. A unique one is this particular marker here, which unfortunately has broken. This piece here would have sat right here on the top. But during the 19th century, there were experiments with different types of material. It was realized that marble eroded, especially in urban areas where there was much industrial pollution. And companies came up with different ways to find a better material that would last. And one of the materials that was utilized was a zinc-coated metal that was marketed at the time as monumental bronze. It was made, this particular marker was made by the Monumental Bronze Company of Connecticut. They also had a factory in Philadelphia. And if you listen, you can hear that the marker is made completely out of this zinc-coated metal. And the zinc coating on it prevents it from rusting. With the exception of the fact that it's broken in half, it does not erode like the marbles had. They were standard stock designs, so from a company catalog you could buy the basic design, and then an inset with the name would be placed in here and bolted into the monument. This is the only monumental bronze marker here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. But the company in the late 1800s and early 1900s did produce quite a number of these monuments, and at least today you can find examples of them scattered throughout cemeteries here in central New Jersey. Another common element of the 19th century garden cemetery were fraternal and military societies buying plots within the burial ground. And here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery we have an example of that. This is the GAR plot, what was the Grand Army of the Republic. This was the veterans organization for Civil War soldiers, and members of the organization could get a free burial spot within that plot. They were also supplied with a free headstone, compliments of the federal government. Plots like this helped to bring the living back into the cemetery. For during Memorial Day and Veterans Day, the community would often gather at a plot like this and commemorate those individuals that had died fighting for the causes of our country. In the early 1980s, an African slave burial ground was discovered just over the other side of this hill, in an area along River Road where a housing development was being constructed. The development was impacting on the area where these individuals were buried, and so the remains were disinterred and moved here to Chestnut Hill Cemetery. In 1983, there was a commemoration of the reinterment of these individuals, and this modern granite marker was purchased for that commemoration. On each side of the granite marker, and possibly this one out front here, are the original field stone markers from the late 1700s, early 1800s that were used to mark the graves. The stone states in memory of those individuals whose lives were spent in servitude to the Barkaloo family. The Barkaloo family lived further up on River Road in what's now South River, and ironically their graves were also moved about a decade earlier to Washington Monumental Cemetery in South River. One of the unusual but absolutely intriguing plots here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery is this one that I'm standing in. Unfortunately, there's not any records on the individual or people that are buried here. Legend has it that there was a Native American woman that was interred in this plot, and that each of her children created a homemade concrete marker to mark the grave. But when we look closely, we can see that there are a number of individuals that are interred here. Some of these concrete markers have dates of 1921 in the back. There's another grave to the back corner of the plot from the 1950s. And if we take a close look, we have a cement marker that's been embellished with tiles manufactured by the Old Bridge Enamel Brick and Tile Company. And this one here dates to January of 1919. Just behind me is another ceramic marker that's embellished with shells. Then off to the side here are some other cement markers, again with tile that's been inset in the, and over there on the left. Unfortunately, a plot like this only leaves more questions than we have answers for, and perhaps some point in the future we'll have a better understanding of the individual or people that are buried within this plot. This is the Tom family plot. Keeping with the other family plots from that time period, we can see the large central family monument. This one's made from a pink-colored granite, and the headstones up front to 4 individuals of the Tom family. This is the gravestone of James Crawford Thom. James Crawford Thom was a well-known artist in the 19th century. He was born in Newark in 1835, and he honed his artist skills by studying abroad in Europe. In the 1880s, he married a local resident of the Old Bridge section of East Brunswick, and for a time he lived just on the other side of the hill and painted many local scenes of the neighborhood. He later moved to the Atlantic Highlands, but when he died in 1898, he was interred here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Today, you can visit the East Brunswick Museum and see a very large collection of James Crawford Thom's paintings, including many that he did when he lived here in this area in the late 1800s. There are many former residents of East Brunswick that are buried here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, and also from the surrounding communities. This is the Hoffman plot. Ada Hoffman and Frank Hoffman, who both lived here on the other side of the hill in the township's, what's now the township's historic district. Their house is still standing on Cosman Street. They were the mother and father of Harold Hoffman, who was governor of New Jersey in the 1930s, a governor during the Lindbergh kidnapping trial. If we look at some of the other markers here in the cemetery, there are names that may ring a bell to people here in East Brunswick today. The Rue family, who had a farm on Rue's Lane where the Brunswick Square Mall is today. Also the Dunham family's buried here, whose farm was near the Dunham's Corner section of East Brunswick. If we come down here, the Culver stone for Daniel Culver. Daniel Culver worked with William Rogers, whose plot we explored earlier. He helped out on William Rogers' sailing vessel, transporting goods and produce to New York City, and for a while he also lived in the Rogers house at that time when he was working for the family. If we move down here to the Layton family plot, this is a broken column design, a revival of classical styles in the late 1800s, a style that was popular with cemetery monuments, made from granite, a polished granite surface with a rock-faced base on it. Charles Layton, who was born in 1846 and died in 1928, operated a grist mill, also just on the other side of the hill in what's the Old Bridge section of East Brunswick. And a grist mill was an area, was a building where farmers could bring their grain to be ground into flour. So this is the Layton family marker, and we're going to move on over to the Harvey Van Heist stone. This is a granite marker commemorating Harvey Van Heist, who died in 1897. And it's got a wonderful Gates of Heaven design on the front of it. This was made by taking a rubber stencil and placing it over the surface of the stone, and then the marker was sandblasted, and the sand would bounce off the rubber mat, and what was exposed would be etched out from the sandblasting. And we can also see with this particular marker that it's signed by the carver that made it. Although this marker wasn't purchased through a Sears and Roebuck catalog, and we know because the carver's name was signed on the base, markers very similar to this could be purchased through the Sears and Roebuck mail order catalogs from the turn of the century. In fact, they had a special catalog that you could send away for that was all on cemetery and monument designs that ranged from a couple dollars all the way up to $100 for a monument. I couldn't come to Chestnut Hill Cemetery without stopping at the grave of the Kramers. I knew Martha Kramer and her husband Bill Kramer. Bill Kramer moved to East Brunswick in 1910. He died in 1996, and he had many stories to share of the people that lived in this area. And much of what I spoke about today came from sitting down and talking to Bill Kramer about the history of this area. And I hope we learned that cemeteries have many stories. We talked about the design of Chestnut Hill Cemetery. We spoke of the people that created the markers here. We spoke about the different kinds of materials. And of course, we spoke about the stories of the people that are buried here. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied, and please join me again as we travel down the history trail.